Hello everyone, and welcome to Catch. This is a video tutorial for the female headphone jack. The first step is to gather all your supplies. This includes about a wingspan length of speaker cable, a female headphone jack, large and small heat shrink, wire strippers, a soldering iron, a fan, solder, flux, and helping hands. The first thing you want to do is unscrew the headphone jack from the sheathing. Ensure that the small diameter heat shrink wrapping is the ideal length for the headphone jack. Trim it so that when held up to the circular positive terminal, it extends just beyond the longer negative terminal. Next, split the wire with your fingernails about an inch down. Trim the black negative wire so that it is even with the negative terminal when held up to the headphone jack. This ensures that when connected, both wires will lay flat against the sheathing. After trimmed correctly, you may then strip about 4 to 5 millimeters of sheathing off of the cables to expose the copper underneath. Twist the wires so that they form one strand. Then slide the smaller diameter trimmed heat shrink onto the positive red wire. You may then attach the black wire to the negative terminal. Do this by inserting it through the inside of the port, going out of the circle. Fold over the wire so that there is copper touching copper, as shown here. Next, insert the red wire in a similar fashion into the circular terminal on the headphone jack. Ensure that you fold the wires correctly by tugging on it and making sure that both wires are laying flat and don't move. After connecting the cables correctly, add flux to each of the joints. Flux encourages the solder to connect completely with both metal faces. Without flux, the solder would oxidize before being able to connect properly with the wire or the headphone jack. This is an example of a poor joint done without flux. You can see that the solder is beating up on the wire and not adhering fully to the headphone jack. You can see that if we tug on this wire, it disconnects from the headphone jack with little issue. Be sure to use flux to avoid this issue. Apply a generous amount of flux to each of the joints to cover all exposed areas. Next, turn on the soldering iron. When the red light on the soldering iron base begins to blink, the soldering iron is fully heated. After it is fully heated, pick it up and clean the tip off in the gold foil. This will remove a lot of the oxidation built up over the time that the soldering iron has been heating. There will, however, be many black spots on the tips. These black spots do not conduct heat as well as the silver spots. Try to find a good silver spot to use for the remainder of this tutorial. The spot should melt solder very quickly, as shown in this video. When applying solder to the tip of the iron, be sure to do this near your fan, as the fumes can be toxic. The fumes are necessary, however, as the solder has a bit of flux in its core. This flux, again, stops oxidation, but if you let the smoke stop, oxidation will render your solder useless. So be sure to not leave solder on your tip for too long. After every time you apply solder to your soldering iron, wipe it in the gold foil. Before soldering the joint, ensure that the wire is wrapped correctly and you've applied a generous amount of flux. Add a small drop of solder to the tip of your iron. Quickly bring this ball of solder to the joint. This will melt the flux and conduct heat into the joint. Wait a second for the joint to heat up. Once it is hot, touch the tip of your solder to the other side of the joint. Ensure that the solder is melting throughout the joint, specifically focusing on the interface of the wire with the metal of the female jack. Once you've applied enough solder, remove the solder and then remove the iron. Ensure that your joint looks like this. One thing to note is that the solder applied to this joint is smoothly flowing into the metal of the port. This means that it has bonded correctly with the metal. If it is beating up, find a member of catch to ensure that the joint is adequately seated. Repeat this procedure on the positive terminal. Again, making sure the joint is hot before applying excess solder. Once you have successfully soldered each joint, cover the positive terminal with the small shrink wrap. Use a heat gun to shrink the shrink wrap over the terminal. Make sure the wrap is covering all exposed metal areas so that the positive and negative metal will not touch when in use. Use the end of your wire strippers to crimp the metal around both wires. This creates a stronger joint and a more resilient headphone jack. After crimping, slide the larger heat shrink over all exposed metal. Shrink it with the heat gun, being sure to not use too much heat. When shrunk correctly, the headphone jack sheathing should slide easily over the shrink wrap and thread onto the headphone port. Congratulations on building your first female headphone jack. You can now use this in adapting your toy